Welcome back to another episode of Metastartup, guys. One problem that's been plaguing me for a while is the fact that I just don't have enough time. And what I started doing over the last few days is waking up super early, and I'm talking about 3 a.m., 4 a.m. in the morning, putting on my clothes. It's freezing cold in Bangalore right now, but I put on my clothes and get started on doing the episodes. A couple of things we're going to start doing a little differently from now. I'm going to start taking or shooting these episodes straight from my room. That saves me a lot of time going upstairs to my amphitheater and doing the videos and then taking it down. Instead, I'm going to feed the audio directly into the computer, so it saves me on editing time. Secondly, for some of the more informative topics, I'm going to be using a slide deck. I'm going to be making these slide decks. And of course, as always, these slide decks are available on the Metastartup Facebook group. So if you ever need to download them, you can find them there. But I've been making these slide decks in my free time, which I then narrate over these videos. These slide decks are super informative. They're all based on my experiences, based on actual statistics, and they will come in handy. And as always, they are 100% free. In this video, I want to explore the different types of startups. And by types of startups, I don't mean, the difference between a mom and pop store and a venture scale startup. I'm talking about the ways a regular startup can be split into so that you can figure out where on the map you are as a startup. So without much further ado, let's get to the slides. In this video, we're going to talk about the types of startups. The type of a startup is primarily based on what it's selling and how it sells it. There are two broad classifications to this. The first is a services startup and the other one is a product startup. Regardless of what startups start as, eventually, and what I mean by eventually is that 4, 5 or even 10 years into the future, whether you started as a services company or a product company, you eventually become a hybrid. And we're going to talk about hybrids towards the end of this episode. So now that we know that there are product startups and services startups, let's quickly compare them. I'll do a longer comparison in the next couple of videos, but generally products are high risk, right? You're probably selling something. You're probably selling software or a t-shirt or something. There is a particular product you are selling. There's a longer incubation time. Obviously, it takes you longer to make the right product. But the cool thing is that your headcount doesn't scale linearly, which means that if you're selling 100 t-shirts today, and you have 100 employees, it does not mean that you will go to 1,000 employees when you have to sell 1,000 t-shirts. Instead, your headcount will scale by a small number while your sales scale exponentially as long as the market is buying your product and shows a need. On the other hand, services are low risk, which means that you can start at any time. You can even start it on the side, do some consulting. I like to say that, in the general spectrum of things, you should start as a freelancer, then start doing services, and then eventually move to a product company. That is the path that I took, and that's the path that a lot of successful entrepreneurs took as well. They're low risk, which means that you don't need too much capital to start them. As long as you have 1 or 2 people in your team who have the skills, and these skills are sellable, you don't need too much money, except to pay them salaries. The incubation and the launch is very quick, which means that you could have a services company registered and up and running within, a few weeks. But the headcount scales linearly. Typically, when there's a client and they're paying you a certain amount for services, there is a fixed number of hours that somebody in your team has to devote to that client per day or per week, right? Regardless of how big you get as a startup or how many tools that you use that makes things a little faster, you will still need to scale headcount linearly. Which means that if you're working with 100 clients and it takes 100 man hours today, if you're working with 1,000 clients, it will roughly take you 1,000 hours to deliver, right? Even with a few tools, you might be shaving off a few hours here and there, but in general, headcount scales linearly. You need to spend more man hours. So TCS and Mu Sigma, they're examples of two quite famous services companies. They were easy to launch, they perform some work for cash, and their main value is in the talent that they hire. And eventually, once they become big, it's the brand and the network that they bring as well. Now, when we talk about product companies, there are two separate classifications of product companies: hardware and physical products or software products. Now, all of these classifications that I'm talking about, they are loose classifications, which means that a product company can have some services elements and a services company can pitch, a tool or two in their services. But what we're talking about is what a startup does primarily. Is it primarily a product you sell or primarily a service you sell? Depending on that, we're categorizing this, but these are loose categorizations. There are no set borders. It just helps us understand startups better if we set these borders. So talking about hardware product startups, it does not necessarily have to be an iPhone that is called a hardware product, right? It could even be Medimix soap, which means there's some proprietary technology that goes into building or manufacturing the product. And if a product market fit is found, which means that if the market is willing to pay for the product, then there is significant defensibility and revenue potential. The word defensibility means that the product has long-term value and will be on the market for a lot longer than just a service, because it is not easy for a competitor to come and build the same product and claim that they are a Medimix, because they're not. Medimix has already built a brand and they have some proprietary technology behind them. The value is mainly in the technology or the product itself, the formula of say Colgate or Coke. That is the value, right? In this case, I'm calling it technology, but in the case of say Coca-Cola, the technology is the formula or the recipe itself. They have some loyal customers, and of course, as time goes on, these companies become brands. But one drawback is that these are the most expensive to launch. They're capital intensive because in order to get the formula right or the technology right, you need to spend more money. So far we've been talking about hardware product startups, but there are some software product startups that you're familiar with as well. It's less expensive to run a software product startup, but it's more expensive than services. Software technology is not as defensible as it was in the 2000s, unless you're building some incredible technology that nobody's seen before. The reason for this is that if you build a simple technology tool, say if you build a menu scanning app, right? A lot of people across the world can easily build that technology as well, as long as they're a computer scientist and they've learned a little bit of engineering, or if they've got a little bit of coding ability, they can easily replicate what you already have. So it's not as defensible as before, but today the value is in the database that these companies build, the brand and the audience, right? And companies like Facebook again, there are many aspects to Facebook, but the better companies to look at are companies like Intuit, which specifically sells software to manage your accounts, or Zoho, which sells an entire suite of software all the way from accounts to invoicing or live chat or whatever. Now, software startups can be broken down into pieces as well. The first one that you're probably most familiar with is the e-commerce hybrid, right? We're going to approach this last. But marketplaces and software as a service are the two distinct classifications of software startups. A marketplace basically connects a buyer and a seller, right? They don't own any assets of their own, right? And freelancer.com and eBay are two examples of this. They simply take a cut. That's their business model, right? Whenever a buyer makes a purchase from a seller on the platform, they take a small transaction fee. The value is in the audience data, the loyal customers, and the brand. Then there's another type of software startup, which is called software as a service. This is typically subscription cloud software. In the past, at least for enterprises, you'd pay a lump sum and have a yearly contract and have people come and install software in your office. But today it's subscription cloud software, which means you can access this software from any browser, or it could be downloadable in the case of something like Photoshop. The value is in the technology, the audience data, the loyal customers, and the brand. Defensibility in software as a service startups is starting to lose ground, which means that they were pretty defensible a few years ago, but as it becomes cheaper and easier to build software, these guys are starting to lose their defensibility. Finally, there's e-commerce. Now, e-commerce is actually a hybrid. In the case of Amazon, they provide a full stack service to sellers, which means that they have everything from logistics, packing, so on and so forth, available to the merchant in the form of both software as well as an offline ecosystem. Sometimes Amazon and Flipkart also have their own retailers. In eBay's case, they don't have their own retailers, right? It's just a crowdsourced marketplace. Whereas Amazon's case, they've got Cloudtail, which makes it easier for them to sell their own products to customers. Amazon, for instance, has things like the Amazon Echo or Amazon Fire Stick, which are products that Amazon makes by itself and sells on its own platform. The value is in the brand, the database, and the loyal audience. Now, so far, all the startups we spoke about either fall cleanly into products or services. But there is a new type of startup called a hybrid that combines products and services, right? Because we live in an age where software is easy to build, every product today is seeing a software first approach. So talking about the hybrids, you can have all sorts of permutations and combinations. Swiggy, for example, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Swiggy, they're a marketplace, which means that they have several different restaurants that are available on the platform, but they also own their own fleet. In eBay or Amazon's case, they will outsource the fleet to somebody else, although now Amazon is making plays to get its own fleet. But in general, Swiggy owns its own fleet, and that is a service that they're giving to the customers who buy food. And at the same time, they own a marketplace. Zara makes clothes, which are obviously physical products, but they also have their own e-commerce store, which is a software product. This is all combined value. The value of a hybrid is the value of the services component plus its product component. And again, I made out all of these examples to be very linear. I'm talking about companies like Intuit, Facebook, Freelancer, eBay, Amazon. They're all hybrids, right? Which is the point I was getting to. When you start as a small company, you start doing one very particular thing. But as you get bigger and bigger and bigger, you diversify and eventually add on services on top, because let's face it, who doesn't want to make more money? So that's at the end of this episode. In the next episode, we're going to talk about the 3 reasons you should start a services company.